The frigid midnight wind whistled through the canyon as Nora Zimmerman's trembling hands clutched the reins of her stolen horse. Blood seeping through her tattered wedding dress where the thorns had scratched her flesh during her desperate escape. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit had finally faded, but the terror remained lodged in her chest like a bullet. Edmund Harrington would never let her go, not after she'd humiliated him by fleeing their wedding night before he could claim what he believed was rightfully his. The year was 1879, and the Colorado Territory stretched before her, vast and unforgiving. Nora had been raised a banker's daughter in Denver, sheltered and unprepared for the harshness of the frontier. Yet here she was, having risked everything rather than submit to a marriage arranged by her father to a man whose cruelty was matched only by his wealth and influence. Her horse stumbled on the uneven trail, exhaustion evident in its labored breathing. Nora knew she couldn't push the animal much further. The pale moonlight revealed little of her surroundings except for the looming silhouettes of mountains against the star-studded sky. She had been riding for nearly 6 hours, following nothing but instinct and the North Star. When she spotted a faint glow in the distance, Nora hesitated. It could be a homestead where she might find shelter, but it could just as easily be one of Edmund's men. She had heard him giving orders to search every settlement within 50 miles. Still, with the temperature dropping and her strength waning, she had little choice. As she approached, she could make out a small ranch nestled at the base of the foothills. A single lantern burned in the window of a modest cabin, smoke curling from the chimney into the night sky. Nora guided her horse toward it, each step bringing a mixture of hope and dread. She had nearly reached the property when her horse finally gave out, collapsing beneath her with a pained whinny. Nora tumbled to the ground, pain shooting through her ankle as she landed awkwardly. She stifled a cry, knowing that sound carried far in the night air. Pulling herself to her feet, she limped the remaining distance to the cabin door. Her knuckles had barely grazed the weathered wood when the door swung open, revealing the silhouette of a tall man holding a rifle at the ready. "State your business," came a deep voice, wary but not immediately threatening. "Please," Nora whispered, her voice cracking from thirst and fear. "I need help. I'm running from someone." The man lowered his rifle slightly, lifting his lantern to better see her. The light illuminated a face weathered by sun and hardship, but with eyes that showed immediate concern at her condition. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and several days' growth of beard. "Good Lord, miss," he said, taking in the sight of her torn wedding dress, bleeding scratches, and the desperation in her eyes. "Come inside before you freeze to death." He stepped back, allowing her entry to the warmth of his cabin. As she limped inside, he quickly scanned the darkness behind her before bolting the door. "My horse," she began, but he was already nodding. "I'll tend to it after I've seen to you. Sit by the fire before you catch your death." Nora sank gratefully onto a wooden chair near the hearth, the warmth making her realize just how cold she had become. The man moved efficiently around the small space, pouring water from a kettle into a cup and adding herbs from a small tin. "Drink this," he said, handing her the steaming cup. "It'll help with the chill." She accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn," he supplied. "Vaughn O'Malley, this is my ranch such as it is." "Nora Zimmerman," she replied, then immediately regretted giving her real name if Edmund's men came asking. "You're running from someone in a wedding dress," Vaughn observed, taking a seat across from her. "I reckon there's quite a story there." Nora stared into her cup, unsure how much to reveal. This man had shown her kindness, but she knew nothing about him. For all she knew, he might return her to Edmund for a reward. "I was to be married today," she finally said. "The arrangement was not of my choosing." "Forced marriage?" Vaughn asked, his expression darkening. "My father arranged it. The man, Edmund Harrington, is wealthy and powerful. A cattle baron from Texas who's been buying up land all through Colorado. My father owed him money and she swallowed hard. I was the payment." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "And this Harrington, he's the type to come looking for what he considers his property." Nora nodded, fear rising again in her throat. "He has men searching everywhere. I overheard him say they'd check every town and homestead between Denver and La Veta. La Veta, Vaughn raised an eyebrow. That's about 30 miles south of here. We're just outside of Walsenburg. I was aiming for La Veta, Nora admitted. I have a distant cousin there who might help me, but I got lost in the dark. Vaughn stood, moving to a small window and peering out into the night. You've come a long way on horseback in a wedding dress. That took courage. Or desperation, she murmured. He turned back to her, his expression softening. Sometimes they're the same thing. Look, Miss Zimmerman, Nora, please. Nora, then, I can't in good conscience turn you out, especially not with men hunting you. You can stay here tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by wariness. Why would you help me? You don't know me. I know enough, he said simply. I know what it's like to run from something that would destroy you. There was something in his voice, a thread of old pain that resonated with her own current anguish. Before she could respond, he grabbed his coat from a hook by the door. I'll go tend to your horse and bring him to the barn. You should rest. There's a bedroom through that door. It's not much, but it's clean. I'll take the chair out here. I couldn't possibly. You can and you will, he said firmly. You're exhausted and hurt. We both need rest if we're going to figure out what to do come morning. As he moved toward the door, Nora called out softly, Mr. O'Malley. He paused, hand on the latch. Thank you, she said, the simple words carrying the weight of her gratitude. He nodded once. We all need shelter sometimes, Nora, not just from storms, but from the cruelties of this world. His voice softened. We heal together or not at all. That's what my mother used to say. With that, he slipped out into the night, leaving Nora alone with the crackling fire and the first sense of safety she had felt in months. Dawn broke with a gentle persistence over the foothills, casting long shadows across Vaughn O'Malley's modest ranch. Nora awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous night came rushing back. She sat up in the narrow bed, wincing at the soreness in her muscles and the throbbing in her ankle. Someone had placed a set of clothes at the foot of the bed, a simple cotton shirt and trousers that would be far too large for her, but infinitely more practical than her ruined wedding dress. Next to them sat a basin of water and a sliver of soap. After washing as best she could and changing into the offered clothes, Nora rolled up the sleeves and pant legs before tentatively opening the bedroom door. The main room was empty, but a pot of coffee simmered on the small stove, and the embers in the fireplace had been recently stoked. She helped herself to a cup of coffee, the rich aroma reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten. As if summoned by the thought, the front door opened and Vaughn entered with an armful of kindling. He stopped short when he saw her standing there. You're up, he said, depositing the wood next to the fireplace. How's the ankle? Swollen, but I can walk, she replied. Thank you for the clothes, he nodded, looking slightly uncomfortable at the sight of her in his attire. They were my sister's. She stayed with me for a time before. He trailed off, then cleared his throat. I've got breakfast nearly ready outside. Thought you might want to eat in the fresh air, see the place in daylight. Nora followed him outside, blinking in the morning sun. What she hadn't been able to see in the darkness was now revealed a small but well-kept ranch with a barn, corral, and about 20 head of cattle grazing in a nearby meadow. Beyond the immediate property, the land rose into the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, their peaks still capped with late spring snow. It's beautiful, she said honestly. It's not much compared to what you're probably used to, Vaughn replied, leading her to a rough-hewn table under a cottonwood tree where he had set out plates of eggs and bacon. But it's mine, free and clear. You live here alone, she asked, taking a seat. Just me and the stock these days, he confirmed. Used to have a partner fellow named Caleb, but he moved on to Wyoming last year, said Colorado was getting too crowded. A faint smile touched his lips at this. As they ate, Vaughn explained that his ranch was relatively isolated, about 5 miles from the nearest neighbor and 10 from the town of Walsenburg. Your horse will need at least a few days' rest, he told her. He's a fine animal, but he was near collapse when you arrived. I've got him comfortable in the barn. Nora set down her fork, anxiety returning. I can't stay here that long. If Edmund's men are searching, they'll eventually find this place. I don't want to bring trouble to your door after you've been so kind." Vaughn studied her for a moment, his green eyes thoughtful. "What's your plan, then? La Veta is still a fair distance, and your cousin might not even be there. From what you've said, this Harrington has the means to keep searching for a long while." "I thought perhaps California," she said quietly. "Or Oregon, somewhere far enough that he wouldn't follow." "That's a hard journey for a woman alone," Vaughn observed, "especially one with no experience of frontier life." Nora bristled slightly. "I may have been raised in comfort, Mr. O'Malley, but I'm not helpless." "I made it this far, didn't I?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That you did. Still, there's a difference between a desperate flight and a planned journey. The territories between here and the coast are unforgiving." Before she could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats caused them both to freeze. Vaughn was on his feet in an instant, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. "Inside," he said tersely. Now, Nora limped quickly to the cabin, heart pounding. Through the window, she watched as 3 riders approached, their horses kicking up dust from the dry trail. They weren't Edmund's men, she was certain she would recognize them, but strangers could be just as dangerous. Vaughn stood his ground as the riders entered his yard, his stance casual but alert. From her vantage point, Nora could see that the newcomers were 2 men and a woman, all dressed in the practical attire of local ranchers. She cracked the window slightly to hear the conversation. "Morning, Vaughn," called the older of the 2 men, tipping his hat. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." "Nathaniel," Vaughn acknowledged with a nod. "Julia, Marcus, what brings you out this way?" The woman Julia spoke next. "There's been some commotion." "Riders from up Denver way, asking questions about a runaway bride, offering good money for information." Nora's blood ran cold. "Is that so?" Vaughn's voice betrayed nothing. "Any particular reason they'd be looking around here?" The younger man, Marcus, leaned forward in his saddle. "They're checking everywhere between Denver and La Veta. Said the woman might be heading for family there. Described her as a blonde, early 20s, likely still in a wedding dress or parts of one." "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Vaughn replied evenly, "but I'll keep an eye out." "There's more," Julia said, her voice lowering. "The man leading the search, Harrington, he's got a mean look about him. Sheriff Palmer told him he'd need to see some proof of his claims before the law would get involved, and this Harrington just laughed, said he had his own law." "Sounds like trouble," Vaughn commented. "Appreciate the warning." Nathaniel shifted in his saddle. "We're heading up to the Wilson place next. Just wanted to make sure you were aware. These aren't men to cross lightly." "I can handle myself," Vaughn assured them, "but I'm obliged for the concern." After a few more minutes of conversation about local matters, cattle prices, the weather, a barn raising planned for the following month, the riders departed. Vaughn waited until they were well out of sight before returning to the cabin. Nora met him at the door, her face pale. "They're looking for me." "They are," he confirmed, his expression grim. "And from the sounds of it, they're not being particularly subtle about it." "I should leave," she said, though the thought filled her with dread. "If they find me here and go where exactly?" Vaughn interrupted. "On foot with an injured ankle, they'd catch you before sundown." "I can't ask you to risk yourself for me," Nora insisted. "You don't know Edmund. He's not a man who forgives being crossed." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "I've met men like him before. Men who think their money and power give them ownership of others." Something dark flickered in his eyes. "I'm not afraid of Edmund Harrington." "You should be," she whispered. He crossed to the fireplace, stoking the embers unnecessarily. "Why did you run, Nora? Was it just the arranged marriage, or was there more?" She sank into a chair, the weight of memory pressing down on her. "I met Edmund 3 months ago when he came to Denver on business. My father was impressed by his wealth, his connections. When Edmund expressed interest in me, my father was enthusiastic, and you weren't. There was something about him that unsettled me from the beginning," she admitted. "A coldness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. But my father insisted the match was advantageous, especially after he lost heavily in some mining investments." Vaughn turned to face her, waiting for her to continue. 2 weeks ago, I overheard Edmund speaking with one of his men. They didn't know I was there. She swallowed hard. He was discussing how he would break me once we were married, how he'd had practice with difficult wives before. Wives? Vaughn's eyes narrowed. Plural? Nora nodded. His first wife died of fever after less than a year of marriage. The second fell from a horse and broke her neck. I later discovered a third who simply disappeared. Most assume she ran off with another man. And you believe he was responsible for their deaths? I know he was, she said with quiet certainty. The way he spoke about them, no one mourns that way. It was as if he was reminiscing about hunting trophies. Vaughn was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "You'll stay here until we figure out something better. The bedroom is yours for as long as you need it." "But the risk is mine to take," he finished firmly. "My nearest neighbors know me as a loner who values his privacy. No one will think it strange if I keep to myself for a while." His mouth curved in a humorless smile. "Besides, I doubt your Edmund is looking for a runaway bride at a bachelor's ranch." Relief and gratitude warred with concern in Nora's heart. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You can start by helping with the chores," Vaughn replied, his tone lightening slightly. "A ranch doesn't run itself, and if you're staying, you're working." "I don't know the first thing about ranching," she admitted. "Then you'll learn," he said simply. "We all start somewhere, and who knows, you might find you have talents you never knew about." For the first time since her desperate flight, Nora felt a small flicker of hope. "Where do we begin?" "With your ankle," he said, nodding toward her swollen joint. "Let's wrap that properly, and then I'll show you around the place. If you're going to hide here, you should at least know where everything is." As Vaughn knelt to examine her injured ankle, his calloused hands gentle despite their strength, Nora found herself studying him more closely. There was a quiet competence about him, a self-sufficiency born of years surviving on his own terms. But there was something else too, a sadness, perhaps, or a wariness that suggested his solitude wasn't entirely by choice. "This will hurt," he warned before beginning to wrap her ankle with strips of clean cloth. "But if we do it right, you'll heal faster." As he worked, his earlier words echoed in her mind, "We heal together or not at all." She wondered what wounds he carried, hidden beneath his capable exterior. For now, though, she was grateful simply to have found shelter in the storm that was her life and a protector who seemed to understand exactly what she was running from. The next few days established a rhythm that surprised Nora with its simplicity and purpose. True to his word, Vaughn put her to work as soon as her ankle could bear weight. The tasks were small at first, gathering eggs from the half-dozen chickens that scratched in the yard, helping prepare meals, mending torn shirts that Vaughn sheepishly admitted had been awaiting attention for months. "You don't have to do this," she protested when he handed her the worn clothing. "I'm not your housekeeper." "No, you're not," he agreed, sorting through tools in need of cleaning. "You're someone learning to survive on her own. Might as well make yourself useful while you're at it." There was no malice in his words, just a practical outlook that Nora gradually came to appreciate. Each new skill she mastered: building a proper fire, identifying which plants in his small garden were ready for harvesting, even learning to milk the solitary cow that provided dairy for the ranch, gave her a sense of accomplishment she'd never experienced in her sheltered life in Denver. On the fourth morning, Vaughn presented her with a simple revolver. "Have you ever fired a gun?" he asked, showing her how to check if it was loaded. "Never," she admitted, handling the weapon with trepidation. "Then it's time you learned. Out here, it's a necessary skill." His green eyes met hers directly, especially for someone in your situation. He took her to a clearing behind the barn, set up several cans on a fallen log, and patiently showed her how to stand, aim, and squeeze the trigger rather than pulling it. Her first shots went wild, the recoil stronger than she had anticipated. But by the end of an hour, she had managed to hit 2 of the 6 targets. "Not bad for a beginner," Vaughn said with approval. "We'll practice every day. Your life might depend on it someday." The weight of the gun felt foreign in her hands, but the implicit trust in Vaughn's decision to arm her wasn't lost on Nora. He was preparing her for independence, whether he stayed at his ranch or eventually moved on. As they walked back to the cabin, Nora gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "You mentioned your sister before, is she?" Vaughn's stride faltered slightly before resuming. "Gone, 5 years now." "I'm sorry," Nora said softly. "Was it illness?" His jaw tightened. "No, her husband." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken pain. "Victoria was younger than me by 4 years," he continued after a moment, his voice carefully controlled. "She married too young to a man who seemed respectable enough at first. William Blackwell was a merchant in Pueblo with a good reputation and plenty of money. By the time I realized what kind of man he truly was, it was too late." "What happened?" Nora asked gently. She tried to leave him. "Came here with bruises she couldn't hide anymore." "I wanted her to stay, but she was worried about what he might do if she abandoned their home completely." His hands clenched at his sides. "She went back to get some of her things, planning to return here the next day. She never made it." "He killed her," Nora whispered, the parallels to her own situation sending a chill through her. Vaughn nodded once, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "The law called it an accident, a fall down the stairs, but I knew Victoria wasn't clumsy and those stairs had a sturdy railing." He drew a deep breath. "Blackwell had friends in the right places. My accusations were dismissed as a grieving brother's ravings. What did you do?" A shadow crossed his face. "What I had to. Blackwell disappeared about 6 months later during a hunting trip. They never found enough of him to bury." The implication was clear, and Nora found herself not shocked but oddly comforted by the quiet steel in Vaughn's voice. Here was a man who understood precisely what Edmund Harrington was capable of because he had faced such evil before. "That's why you're helping me," she realized. "I remind you of her." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but Victoria isn't the only reason. Some things are simply wrong, regardless of who's involved. A man forcing a woman into marriage, threatening her, hunting her down like property," he broke off, visibly collecting himself. "No one deserves that fate." They reached the cabin in silence, each lost in thought. As Vaughn moved to store the revolver, Nora placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Teach me more," she said with newfound determination. "Not just shooting, everything: how to ride properly, how to find my way by the stars, how to defend myself. If I'm going to survive once I leave here, I need to know these things." Something like approval flickered in his eyes. "It won't be easy." "Neither is being hunted," she countered. "I'm tired of being afraid, Vaughn. I want to be strong enough that men like Edmund can never threaten me again." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll start tomorrow at dawn. But tonight I need to go into town for supplies. We're running low on flour and coffee, and I should see if there's any news about Harrington's men." Concern immediately replaced her determination. "Is that safe?" "Safer than sending you," he pointed out. "I've been overdue for a visit to town anyway. It would look more suspicious if I continued to stay away. Lock the door behind me, keep the gun close, and don't light any lamps after dark." As he prepared to leave, gathering saddlebags and making a list of needed supplies, Nora felt a strange reluctance to see him go. In less than a week, his steady presence had become something she depended on, a realization that both comforted and unsettled her. "Be careful," she said as he mounted his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding. "Always am," he replied with a slight smile. "I should be back before midnight. If I'm not—" He hesitated. "If I'm not, there's a map in the drawer next to my bed. It shows a route to Lavetta that avoids the main roads. Don't wait for me past dawn." The instructions sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her, but Nora nodded resolutely. "I'll be here." She watched him ride away, his figure gradually diminishing until he disappeared around a bend in the trail. The ranch felt suddenly empty, the silence oppressive where before it had been peaceful. Nora spent the afternoon keeping busy with chores, feeding the animals, weeding the garden, preparing a stew that would be ready whenever Vaughn returned. As dusk fell, she reluctantly extinguished the lamps as instructed and sat in the dimness, the revolver never far from her reach. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Every distant sound, an owl's call, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods, The occasional lowing of cattle in their pasture made her start. By the time the moon had risen high in the sky, Nora's nerves were stretched to breaking point. Just when she had convinced herself that something terrible must have happened to Vaughn, she heard the distinct rhythm of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Relief flooded through her, only to be immediately replaced by caution. She moved to the window, straining to see in the moonlight. It was Vaughn, but he wasn't alone. Another rider accompanied him, a woman, based on the silhouette. Nora's hand tightened on the revolver as she waited by the door, 3 sharp knocks followed by 2 softer ones, the signal they had arranged. She unbolted the door with trembling fingers. Vaughn entered first, carrying several packages. Behind him came a woman perhaps a few years older than Nora, dressed in practical riding clothes, her dark hair pulled back in a simple knot. "Nora, this is Clara Wilson," Vaughn said without preamble. "She's the midwife for most of the county and the closest thing to a doctor we have around these parts. Clara, this is Nora." The woman nodded in greeting. "Vaughn says you've had a rough time of it. Thought I might check that ankle, make sure it's healing properly." Nora looked questioningly at Vaughn, who was busy unloading supplies onto the table. "Clara can be trusted," he said, answering her unspoken concern. "Her sister had a similar experience a few years back. She understands the situation." "More than you might think," Clara added grimly. "Harrington's men came to our farm yesterday, asking questions. My husband sent them on their way, but they're being thorough in their search." While Clara examined Nora's ankle, declaring it to be healing well but still in need of rest, Vaughn related what he had learned in town. "Harrington himself arrived in Walsenburg this afternoon," he said, his expression grave. "He's offering $500 for information leading to your return, a fortune for most folks around here. Has anyone seen through my disguise?" Nora asked, gesturing to her now cropped hair, which she had cut short with shears 3 days earlier as a precaution. "Not yet," Vaughn replied, "but it's only a matter of time before someone makes the connection, especially since Harrington is showing a photograph of you to anyone who will look." Clara finished rewrapping Nora's ankle and sat back. "Which is why we need to move quickly. Vaughn and I have a plan, but it's not without risk." "What kind of plan?" Nora asked warily. "The kind that gets you far from here," Vaughn said. "Clara's brother-in-law runs freight wagons to Santa Fe. He's leaving tomorrow with a shipment if you were hidden among his cargo." "I could get all the way to New Mexico territory," Nora finished, hope rising despite her caution. "But wouldn't that put him in danger?" Clara smiled slightly. "Daniel doesn't much care for men who chase women across state lines, and he owes me a favor after I saved his son from pneumonia last winter. He's willing to help." "Once you reach Santa Fe," Vaughn continued, "you'd have options. The railroads there could take you west to California or north toward Denver, where you could catch an eastbound train if you preferred." "It's a good plan," Clara assured her. "Daniel is trustworthy and his wagons are rarely searched. He's been running freight for 15 years without incident." Nora looked between them, touched by the risks they were taking on her behalf. "When would I leave?" "Tomorrow at dusk," Clara replied. "Daniel will stop his wagons about a mile south of here, just long enough for you to climb aboard. By morning, you'll be well on your way to New Mexico." After Clara departed, promising to return the following evening to guide Nora to the meeting point, an unusual silence fell between Nora and Vaughn. He busied himself putting away the supplies, his movements more abrupt than usual. "You don't think I should go?" Nora observed, watching him. He paused, hands resting on a sack of flour. "It's not that. The plan is solid. Daniel knows what he's doing." But Vaughn turned to face her, his expression conflicted. "But once you're on that wagon, you're alone again. If something goes wrong, if Harrington somehow tracks you to Santa Fe." "I'll have the skills you've taught me," she reminded him, "and I'll be far enough away to make a fresh start." He nodded, though the tension didn't leave his shoulders. "It's your decision. I just want to be sure you understand the risks." "I do," she assured him, stepping closer. "And I'm grateful more than I can express for everything you've done. But I can't hide here forever, putting you in danger every day Harrington remains in the area." "You could," Vaughn said quietly, surprising her. "Stay, I mean, not forever, but longer." The simple statement hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to voice. In the few days they had known each other, something undefinable had grown, a connection forged through shared understanding of pain and survival. "Vaughn," she began, uncertain how to respond. He shook his head as if clearing away unwelcome thoughts. "Forget I said that. Clara's plan is the safest option. You should rest, tomorrow will be a long day." As Nora retreated to her borrowed bedroom, she found herself torn between the promise of freedom that Santa Fe represented and the unexpected security she had found in Vaughn O'Malley's quiet strength. For the first time since her flight from Denver, the path forward wasn't clear. She lay awake long into the night, listening to Vaughn moving quietly around the cabin, and wondered what kind of life might have been possible if they had met under different circumstances, if she hadn't been running, if he hadn't been scarred by his sister's fate, if the shadow of Edmund Harrington wasn't looming over them both. By morning, she had made her decision. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist shrouding the foothills, as if nature itself was conspiring to conceal Nora's planned escape. She emerged from the bedroom to find Vaughn already awake, coffee brewing on the stove and a small bundle prepared on the table. "Provisions," he explained, nodding toward the package. "Dried meat, biscuits, a canteen of water, enough to see you through the journey to Santa Fe." "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered, "for this and for everything else." He nodded once, his expression carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about your route once you reach New Mexico. California might be your best option. It's far enough from Harrington's reach, and there are communities where a woman alone wouldn't attract too much notice." Nora sipped her coffee, watching him over the rim of her cup. "I've been thinking too," she said slowly. "About Santa Fe and California and alternatives." Vaughn paused in his preparations, giving her his full attention. "What if I didn't go?" she asked quietly, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What if there was another way to end this one that didn't involve me running for the rest of my life?" Nora set down her cup, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "Harrington has power because of his wealth and connections, but even men like him have vulnerabilities." "You're not suggesting confronting him," Vaughn said, alarm evident in his voice. "That would be suicide." "Not confrontation exposure," she clarified. "Before I fled, I took something from Edmund's study papers that prove he's been bribing officials to look the other way while he seizes land from smaller ranchers. It's how he's built his empire so quickly." Vaughn's eyes widened slightly. "You have evidence of corruption?" Nora nodded. "Hidden in the lining of my wedding dress. I took it as insurance, thinking I might need to negotiate my freedom if he caught me, but what if it could serve a greater purpose?" "The law won't touch him," Vaughn warned. "Men like Harrington buy their way out of trouble." "Not if the evidence is made public," Nora countered. "Not if everyone from Denver to Santa Fe learns how he's acquired his holdings. His power comes from his reputation as much as his money. Destroy one and you weaken the other." Vaughn considered this, his expression thoughtful. "It's still dangerous, more dangerous than simply disappearing. But it offers a permanent solution," she argued. "If Harrington is disgraced, if his empire begins to crumble, he won't have the resources or influence to continue hunting me. And if it fails, if the evidence isn't enough, then I still have California," she said simply, "but at least I'll have tried to fight back instead of merely running." A slow smile spread across Vaughn's face, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "You're not at all what I expected when you showed up on my doorstep half frozen in a wedding dress." "Is that a good thing?" she asked, returning his smile hesitantly. "A very good thing," he assured her. "If we're going to do this, though, we need a better plan than simply publishing the documents. We need to ensure they reach the right people, newspapers, honest officials, perhaps even the governor." "We," Nora echoed, hope rising in her chest. Vaughn's expression turned serious. "I'm not letting you face this alone, Nora. Whatever path you choose, running or fighting, I'm with you." The simple declaration warmed something deep inside her that had been cold for too long. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk everything for someone you barely know?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "Because sometimes life gives you a second chance to do what's right. I couldn't save Victoria, but perhaps together we can ensure that Harrington never hurts another woman the way he intended to hurt you." The honesty in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," he cautioned. "If we're going to expose Harrington, we need to move quickly before his men discover your connection to this ranch." They spent the morning formulating a plan, spreading Nora's stolen documents across the table and studying them carefully. The evidence was damning detailed records of payments to judges, land commissioners, even a state senator, all designed to help Harrington expand his holdings at the expense of smaller ranchers and homesteaders. "We need copies," Vaughn decided. "Multiple sets that can be distributed simultaneously. That way, if one is intercepted, others will still reach their destinations." "But how do we make copies?" Nora asked. "And who do we trust to deliver them?" "Clara might know someone with access to a printing press," Vaughn suggested. "As for delivery," he paused, thinking. "I have a few friends from my army days scattered across the territory, men who would help without asking too many questions." By midday, their strategy was taking shape. When Clara arrived that evening, expecting to escort Nora to the waiting freight wagons, she was surprised to find them both waiting with an entirely different proposal. "It's riskier than running," she acknowledged after hearing them out. "But if it works, it would do more than just save you, Nora. It would help a lot of people Harrington has wronged over the years." "Then you'll help us?" Nora asked. Clara nodded decisively. "My cousin runs the printing shop in Pueblo. He's no friend to the powerful men who have been squeezing small ranchers off their land. I can take your documents to him tomorrow. Tell Daniel we're grateful for his offer, but we won't need his help just yet," Vaughn said. "Though if things go badly, we might call on him later." "I'll let him know," Clara promised. "In the meantime, you two should prepare for every possibility. Once Harrington realizes what you're doing, he'll come at you with everything he has." After Clara departed with the original documents securely hidden in her medical bag, Nora and Vaughn began practical preparations for the confrontation they knew was coming. They cleaned and loaded every weapon on the ranch, moved supplies to the root cellar in case they needed to retreat there, and planned escape routes in multiple directions. That evening, as they sat by the fire reviewing their plans one final time, Nora found herself studying Vaughn's profile, struck by how quickly he had become essential to her world. "What happens after?" she asked suddenly. "If we succeed, if Harrington is exposed and his power broken, what then?" Vaughn turned to face her, the firelight casting shadows across his features. "What do you want to happen?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Before meeting Vaughn, before experiencing the quiet strength of his ranch and the purpose she had found here, Nora might have said she wanted to return to civilization, perhaps not Denver, but some other city where she could rebuild a life similar to the one she had known. Now, she wasn't so sure. She began, then paused, gathering her courage. "I want a life that's mine, not my father's vision for me, not society's expectations, a life with purpose and freedom." "You could find that in many places," Vaughn observed, his voice carefully neutral. "I could," she agreed. "But I've started to think that maybe what matters isn't where you are, but who you're with." The words hung between them, an admission neither had been ready to voice until now. Vaughn's expression softened, the wariness that usually guarded his features momentarily absent. "Nora," he said quietly, "I can't offer you the comforts you grew up with. This ranch is modest at best." "Comfort isn't what I'm seeking," she replied with equal quietness. "Connection is, understanding, the chance to build something meaningful." She drew a deep breath. "The night I arrived, you said something that stayed with me. We heal together or not at all. I think I'm beginning to understand what that means." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, Vaughn reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle. "I never expected you," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "After Victoria, after what happened with Blackwell, I thought it was better to keep to myself, safer. But then you appeared on my doorstep and everything changed." "For me too," she whispered. I was running from a man who saw me as property. I never imagined I'd find someone who would see me as an equal. The distance between them seemed to diminish, neither certain who moved first. When their lips met, it was tentative at first, a question being asked and answered in the same moment. Then the kiss deepened, carrying the weight of all they had endured separately and all they hoped to face together. When they finally parted, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "Whatever happens with Harrington," he said softly, "know that you have a place here, Nora, for as long as you want it." She closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine a future that just days ago had seemed impossible. "I want it," she whispered. "I want us." Their newfound understanding brought a strange peace, even as they prepared for the storm they knew was coming. That night, Nora slept more soundly than she had since her escape, comforted by the knowledge that whatever trials lay ahead, she would no longer face them alone. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the tension that had settled over the ranch. Clara had promised to return by midday with news from her cousin in Pueblo, and Vaughn and Nora spent the intervening hours checking and rechecking their preparations. "If Harrington comes here," Vaughn said as they inspected the barn for potential defensive positions, "we need to be ready to leave quickly. I've packed saddlebags for both of us with essential supplies." Nora nodded, mentally reviewing the escape routes they had planned. "And if he doesn't?" "If our plan works and the evidence is enough to keep him occupied elsewhere, then we have choices," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Good ones." The sound of approaching riders interrupted their conversation. Vaughn immediately tensed, motioning for Nora to stay behind him as he drew his revolver and moved to the barn door. Through a gap in the weathered wood, they watched as two riders entered the yard. Clara, as expected, and a man Nora didn't recognize. He was younger than Vaughn by several years, with the broad shoulders and watchful demeanor of someone accustomed to trouble. "It's all right," Vaughn said, holstering his weapon. "That's Marcus Wilson, Clara's brother-in-law. He's trustworthy." They emerged from the barn to greet the newcomers, who dismounted with evident urgency. "We have news," Clara announced without preamble. "Some good, some troubling." "Inside," Vaughn suggested, leading them to the cabin where they could speak freely. Once seated around the table, Marcus spoke first. "My cousin at the printing shop was able to make 10 copies of the documents," he reported, placing a thick envelope on the table. "High-quality reproductions that will stand up to scrutiny. He worked through the night to finish them." "That's the good news," Clara added. "The troubling part is that Harrington seems to have picked up your trail, Nora. There were men asking questions in Walsenburg this morning about a lone rancher who keeps to himself. They were particularly interested in whether Vaughn had been seen with a young woman recently." Vaughn's expression darkened. "How much time do we have?" "Not much," Marcus replied grimly. "A day, maybe less. One of Harrington's men was at the general store when I was there, offering money for information about this ranch specifically." Nora felt her heart sink. "Then we need to leave. I won't put any of you in more danger." "It's too late for that," Clara said firmly. "We're already involved. The question now is how to distribute these copies before Harrington can stop us." Marcus leaned forward. "I have a proposition. I'm heading to Denver tomorrow with a cattle shipment. I could deliver copies to the newspaper there, as well as to the governor's office. And I have patients to see in La Veta this afternoon," Clara added. "I could ensure copies reach both the newspaper and the sheriff there." Vaughn nodded slowly, considering. "That leaves copies for Pueblo, Colorado Springs, and perhaps Trinidad to ensure wide coverage." "I could ride to Pueblo today." "No," Nora interrupted. "You're not leaving this ranch undefended, not when Harrington's men could arrive at any moment." A tense silence followed her declaration, broken only when Marcus spoke again. "What about Daniel's freight wagon?" "He's still planning to leave for Santa Fe tonight. He could drop copies in Trinidad along his route." "That might work," Vaughn agreed, "but we still need a solution for Pueblo and Colorado Springs." Clara exchanged a glance with her brother-in-law before saying, "There's another option, though you may not like it." "What is it?" Nora asked. "Bait," Clara said simply. If Harrington is focusing his search here, use that to our advantage. Keep him occupied while others distribute the evidence." Vaughn immediately shook his head. "Absolutely not. I won't use Nora as bait." "Not Nora," Clara clarified. "You, Vaughn, you stay visible, draw attention to yourself in town, make them think you're trying to hide something here at the ranch." Meanwhile, Nora takes the remaining copies to Pueblo herself. "That's too dangerous," Vaughn protested. "Is it?" Marcus countered. "Think about it. They're looking for a woman accompanied by a rancher or a woman hiding at her ranch. They're not looking for a lone woman traveling openly to Pueblo." Nora considered this, a plan forming in her mind. It could work, especially if I weren't dressed as a woman. All eyes turned to her in surprise. "With my hair already cut short and wearing men's clothing," she explained, "I could pass as a young man traveling alone." "No one would look twice at me." Vaughn still looked unconvinced. "Harrington knows what you look like. If you're spotted, he knows what Nora Zimmerman looks like in a wedding dress with long hair," she countered. "He doesn't know what Noah the ranch hand looks like in work clothes and a hat." A reluctant smile tugged at Vaughn's lips. "You're determined to do this, aren't you?" "I'm determined to end this," she corrected. "One way or another." After further discussion, they finalized their plan. Clara and Marcus would take copies as planned to Denver and La Veta. Daniel would receive copies for Trinidad and Santa Fe. Nora, disguised as a young man, would ride to Pueblo with the remaining documents, while Vaughn would create a diversion by making himself conspicuous in Walsenburg, drawing Harrington's attention to the ranch. "If all goes well," Clara said as they prepared to depart, "the newspapers will begin printing their stories within days. Once the evidence is public, Harrington's influence will start to crumble." "And if things don't go well?" Vaughn asked, the concern evident in his voice. Clara squeezed his arm reassuringly. "Then we adjust, but this is the best chance we have to end his reign of terror for good." After Clara and Marcus left to begin their parts of the plan, Nora and Vaughn spent the afternoon preparing for their separation. Vaughn selected his most reliable horse for Nora's journey, a steady gray mare that wouldn't attract attention, and provided detailed instructions on the safest route to Pueblo. "It's about 40 miles, he told her, spreading a map across the table. "At a steady pace, you could make it by late tomorrow. My friend Samuel Jenkins runs the livery stable there. This letter will introduce you to him. He'll help you find the newspaper editor." As evening approached, the time for Nora's departure drawing near, the air between them grew heavy with unspoken fears and hopes. Vaughn checked and rechecked her saddlebags, added an extra blanket in case the night turned cold, and pressed his spare revolver into her hands despite her protests that she already had one. "Better to have it and not need it," he insisted. Finally, as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, there was nothing left to do but say goodbye. Nora stood beside the saddled mare, dressed in Vaughn's old clothes with her hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, looking every bit the young ranch hand they hoped Harrington's men would overlook. 2 days, Vaughn said, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "If everything goes according to plan, meet me at Clara's farm north of La Veta. If I'm not there within 3 days, you will be," Nora interrupted, unwilling to contemplate the alternative. "We both will," he nodded, though the worry didn't leave his eyes. "Be careful. Stick to the less traveled roads, avoid talking to strangers more than necessary, and if you sense any danger, run," she finished. "Trust my instincts, I remember." Vaughn pulled her into a fierce embrace, his arms providing one last moment of shelter before she ventured out to face the world alone again, but this time by choice, with purpose rather than mere desperation driving her forward. "I'll see you in La Veta," she whispered against his chest. "I'll be waiting," he promised. With a final kiss that carried all the emotions words couldn't express, Nora mounted the gray mare and set off down the trail, not looking back for fear her resolve might weaken. Behind her, Vaughn watched until she disappeared from view, then turned to prepare for his own role in their dangerous gambit. As Nora rode through the gathering dusk, the weight of the documents in her saddlebag felt like both a burden and a promise, a chance to reclaim not just her own future, but perhaps to ensure that men like Edmund Harrington could never again treat women as property to be acquired and discarded at will. The trail to Pueblo stretched before her, winding through foothills and valleys, each mile carrying her closer to either victory or disaster. But for the first time since she had fled her wedding, Nora rode forward not with fear as her companion, but with hope and the knowledge that whatever awaited her at journey's end, she would no longer face it alone. The gray mare's hooves struck a steady rhythm as Nora navigated the moonlit trail, every sense alert for signs of danger. She had traveled perhaps 10 miles from Vaughn's ranch when she decided to make camp for a few hours, allowing both herself and the horse to rest before continuing their journey at first light. Finding a small clearing sheltered by cottonwoods, Nora dismounted and went through the motions Vaughn had taught her unsaddling the mare, checking her hooves for stones, securing her to graze on a long lead rope. The familiar task steadied her nerves, giving her hands purpose while her mind raced with possibilities both hopeful and dire. She built a small, nearly smokeless fire as Vaughn had shown her, careful to keep it shielded from potential observers. As she warmed her hands over the modest flames, Nora reflected on how much her life had changed in the span of just 2 weeks. From a banker's daughter bound for a loveless marriage to a fugitive learning to survive on the frontier, the transformation seemed almost unbelievable. And yet somehow she felt more herself than she ever had in Denver. Here, her value wasn't determined by her father's connections or a potential husband's wealth, but by her own courage and determination. Here, she had found purpose beyond the narrow confines of societal expectations. Here, she had found Vaughn. The thought of him brought both warmth and worry. By now, he would be in Walsenburg, deliberately drawing attention to himself, perhaps even facing direct confrontation with Harrington's men. The risk he was taking for her sake, for justice's sake, humbled her. Sleep came in fitful bursts, her rest repeatedly interrupted by the natural sounds of the wilderness that still startled her unaccustomed ears. Shortly before dawn, Nora gave up on further rest and prepared to continue her journey, eager to reach Pueblo before nightfall. The sun was just cresting the eastern horizon when she spotted riders in the distance, 3 men traveling north on the main trail that her path would soon intersect. Instinctively, Nora guided her mare into a stand of trees, watching warily as the men approached. Even from a distance, she recognized the lead rider with a jolt of fear that nearly stopped her heart. Edmund Harrington himself, his broad-shouldered figure unmistakable even after weeks away from his oppressive presence. He was heading directly toward Walsenburg, directly toward Vaughn. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. If Harrington had left the search to personally confront Vaughn, it meant he suspected, perhaps even knew, that Nora had found shelter at the ranch. Vaughn would be walking into a trap. Her first impulse was to turn back to warn him somehow. But the rational part of her mind, the part that had grown stronger during her days at the ranch, reminded her of their plan. The documents she carried were their best hope of neutralizing Harrington's power. If she failed to deliver them, his pursuit would never end. With a silent prayer for Vaughn's safety, Nora waited until the riders were well past before continuing on her way, pushing the mare to a faster pace than she had initially planned. The sooner the newspapers had the evidence, the sooner Harrington's attention would be diverted from Vaughn to his own crumbling empire. By midday, the buildings of Pueblo came into view, the town significantly larger than Walsenburg with its position on the Arkansas River making it an important commercial hub. Nora slowed her approach, consciously adjusting her posture and gait to mirror the young men she had observed around Vaughn's ranch, shoulders slightly hunched, stride loose and confident. Her heart pounded as she rode past the first outlying buildings, certain that at any moment someone would see through her disguise. But the few people she passed barely glanced at her, too absorbed in their own concerns to pay attention to yet another dusty traveler. Following Vaughn's directions, Nora made her way to the livery stable on the eastern edge of town. A weathered sign proclaimed it, Jenkins and Son, EST, 1858. The paint faded, but the business clearly thriving based on the number of horses in the corral. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s emerged from the stable as she dismounted, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "Help you, young fella," he called. "Mr. Jenkins?" Nora asked, deepening her voice slightly. "Samuel Jenkins." The man's expression turned wary. "That's me." "Do I know you, boy?" Nora glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot before responding. "No, sir, but Vaughn O'Malley sent me. I have a letter from him." At the mention of Vaughn, Jenkins's demeanor changed immediately. He gestured for Nora to bring her horse into the stable, closing the door behind them for privacy. "Let's see this letter, then," he said, his voice low. Nora retrieved the sealed envelope from her saddlebag and handed it over. Jenkins broke the seal and read quickly, his eyebrows rising with each line. When he finished, he looked at Nora with new respect. "Seems I've been calling you boy when I should be saying miss," he said quietly. "Vaughn says you're in trouble and need help reaching the newspaper editor without drawing attention." "That's right," Nora confirmed, relieved to drop the pretense of her lowered voice. "I have documents that need to be published as soon as possible, evidence of corruption involving Edmund Harrington." Jenkins let out a low whistle. "Harrington? You don't aim small, do you? That man has fingers in half the businesses in Colorado." "Which is why exposing him is so important," Nora insisted. "Will you help me?" The older man studied her for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Vaughn saved my son's life during the war. If he says you're worth helping, that's good enough for me." He glanced out the stable door toward the street. "Wait here. I'll send my boy to fetch Walter Simmons. He's the editor of the Pueblo Chieftain and no friend to men like Harrington. Better to bring him here than risk you being seen at the newspaper office." While Jenkins dispatched his teenage son on this errand, he insisted Nora eat something and offered her a place to wash away the dust of travel. As she splashed water on her face from the basin he provided, Nora caught a glimpse of her reflection in the small mirror hanging nearby. She barely recognized herself, the short hair, the sun-darkened skin, the determined set of her jaw, all belonging to someone far removed from the sheltered young woman who had fled Denver in a wedding dress. Walter Simmons arrived within the hour, a thin, energetic man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. After brief introductions, Nora presented the copied documents, watching anxiously as the editor examined them with increasingly wide eyes. "This is..." He began, then stopped, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is extraordinary evidence. Bribery, fraud, even suggestions of violence against those who refuse to sell their land. If these documents are authentic." "They are," Nora assured him. "I took them from Harrington's personal files the night I escaped my forced marriage to him." Simmons looked up sharply. "You're the bride everyone's been talking about, the one who disappeared from Denver." Nora nodded, suddenly fearful that the editor might be more interested in that scandal than in Harrington's corruption. But Simmons surprised her. "Then you've shown remarkable courage, Miss Zimmerman, both in escaping and in bringing these documents forward." He carefully returned the papers to their envelope. "I'll need to verify some of these details before publishing, but I have sources who can confirm much of this quickly." "How soon do you need this to appear in print?" "As soon as possible," Nora replied. "Today, if it can be managed." "Lives may depend on it." The editor nodded briskly. "I'll have a special edition out by evening. The Chieftain doesn't usually publish on Sundays, but for this, I'll make an exception." He hesitated, then added, "You should know that this will make you a target beyond what you already are." "Harrington won't take this exposure lightly." "I'm aware of the risk," Nora said quietly, "but the alternative, allowing him to continue unchecked, is worse." After Simmons departed with the documents, Jenkins insisted Nora stay hidden in the small apartment above the stable where his family lived. His wife, a kind-faced woman named Dorothy, provided fresh clothes more suitable for a young woman and helped Nora wash her travel-worn garments. "Samuel told me some of what's happening," Dorothy said as they shared tea in the small kitchen. Not all of it, I suspect, but enough to know you've been through a terrible ordeal. It could have been worse, Nora replied, thinking of Vaughn's sister and the fate she had narrowly avoided herself. Thanks to some unexpected kindness, I found help when I needed it most. Dorothy smiled knowingly. Vaughn O'Malley is a good man, though he keeps to himself these days. Samuel always said that the war and what happened to his sister changed him. He told me about Victoria, Nora said softly, a tragedy that was, Dorothy sighed, and the law did nothing. Sometimes I think frontier justice is the only kind that works out here. The conversation was interrupted by Samuel's return, his expression grave. The newspaper's running the story, he reported. Simmons says his pressmen are working as fast as they can, but there's more. Rumors are flying around town that Harrington himself rode through Walsenburg this morning, headed for a ranch in the foothills with a dozen men. Nora's cup clattered against its saucer. Vaughn's ranch, she whispered. I saw Harrington on the trail. He was heading north while I was traveling south. I had hoped he might miss Vaughn somehow. Vaughn can handle himself, Samuel assured her, though his tone lacked conviction. And once the newspapers start publishing these stories, Harrington will have bigger problems than finding you or Vaughn. But Nora couldn't shake the dread that had settled in her chest. Vaughn had known the risk he was taking by staying behind, by making himself visible to draw Harrington's attention away from her. Now that same risk had materialized in the form of a vengeful, powerful man with a small army at his command. I need to go back, she said, rising from her chair. I need to warn him. You can't, Samuel objected. It's too dangerous if Harrington's men are watching the trails. Then I'll avoid the trails, Nora insisted. Vaughn taught me how to navigate by the stars. I can travel cross-country. Dorothy laid a gentle hand on her arm. Child, I understand your concern, but rushing back won't help. If Harrington is already at the ranch, you'd be riding straight into his hands. The logic of this argument was undeniable, but it did nothing to ease Nora's fear for Vaughn's safety. As the afternoon stretched into evening, she paced the small apartment, alternating between staring out the window toward the north and helping Dorothy prepare the evening meal as a distraction. Just after sunset, Samuel returned from town with a copy of the Pueblo Chieftain's special edition. The headline blazed across the front page, Cattle Baron's Empire Built on Corruption and Violence. Beneath it, Simmons had detailed Harrington's schemes with surprising thoroughness, naming officials who had accepted bribes and describing specific land seizures that had occurred through fraudulent means. Simmons says telegraph operators have been busy all afternoon, Samuel reported. The story's being transmitted to Denver, Colorado Springs, and beyond. By morning, it'll be in every newspaper in the territory. Relief mingled with continued anxiety in Nora's heart. The plan was working. Harrington's corruption was being exposed, but at what cost to Vaughn? Tomorrow, Samuel promised, seeing her distress. First light, I'll ride north with you. We'll find out what's happened at the ranch. That night, sleep eluded Nora completely. She lay awake in the Jenkins' spare room, listening to the occasional sounds of the town and praying that Vaughn had somehow evaded confrontation with Harrington. The alternatives were too painful to contemplate. When dawn finally arrived, she was already dressed and ready, her borrowed clothes exchanged for her own now clean garments, her hair once again tucked beneath a hat. Samuel had prepared their horses, and Dorothy had packed food for the journey. Be careful, Dorothy urged as they prepared to depart. Both of you. They rode out of Pueblo as the town was just beginning to stir, taking a less traveled route that Samuel assured her would be faster than the main trail. The miles seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each ridge and valley bringing both anticipation and dread of what they might discover beyond. By midday, they had covered nearly half the distance to Vaughn's ranch when they encountered a rider coming from the opposite direction. Samuel signaled for caution, his hand moving to the rifle slung across his saddle. As the rider drew nearer, Nora recognized with a surge of hope the chestnut gelding that belonged to Vaughn. But the figure astride it wasn't Vaughn, it was Clara Wilson, her normally neat appearance disheveled, her expression tight with urgency. "Nora," she called, reining in her horse beside them. "Thank God, I was coming to find you. Clara, what are you doing on Vaughn's horse?" Nora demanded, fear clutching at her throat. "Where is he?" "At our farm," Clara replied quickly. "He's alive, Nora, hurt but alive." The flood of relief at hearing Vaughn had survived was immediately tempered by concern over his condition. "What happened? How badly is he injured?" Clara's expression was grim. "Harrington and his men arrived at the ranch yesterday morning. They were looking for you, but when they couldn't find you, they turned their attention to Vaughn. According to my husband, who heard the story in town, Harrington accused Vaughn of harboring a fugitive and demanded to know where you had gone." "And Vaughn wouldn't tell him," Nora surmised, a mixture of gratitude and anguish filling her. Clara nodded. "Harrington's men beat him badly, then set fire to the barn as a warning. They might have done worse, but word arrived that newspapers in Pueblo and La Veta were publishing stories about Harrington's corruption. He and his men rode out immediately, heading back toward Denver." "How did Vaughn get to your farm?" Samuel asked. "Marcus found him when he went to check on the ranch this morning," Clara explained. "He brought Vaughn to us since our place was closer than town. I've tended his wounds as best I can, but he's asking for you, Nora." "That's why I came looking. I knew you'd be coming from Pueblo." Without further discussion, they altered their course, following Clara eastward toward the Wilson farm. As they rode, Clara provided more details about Vaughn's injuries: broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, numerous cuts and bruises, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and proper care. "What about the ranch?" Nora asked, dreading the answer. "The barn is a loss," Clara admitted. "But the cabin still stands. Harrington's men tried to burn it too, but the recent rains had soaked the wood, and the fire didn't catch properly." By late afternoon, they arrived at the Wilson farm, a prosperous-looking homestead with several outbuildings and well-tended fields. Marcus met them in the yard, his expression relieved. "He's awake," he reported as Nora dismounted. "Been asking for you every hour on the hour." Clara led her to a bedroom in the farmhouse where Vaughn lay on a neatly made bed, his torso wrapped in bandages, his face bruised but his eyes alert. When he saw Nora in the doorway, a smile broke through the pain etched on his features. "You made it," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "So did you," she replied, rushing to his side and carefully taking his hand in hers. "Though it seems you had a rougher time of it than I did." "Worth it," he assured her. "The papers, did they publish the evidence?" "They did," she confirmed. "The Pueblo chieftain ran a special edition yesterday. By now, the story should have reached Denver and beyond." Relief relaxed some of the tension in Vaughn's body. "Then Harrington's in for a fight he can't win with bribes or threats. His investors will abandon him once they realize the scrutiny they'll face." Nora squeezed his hand gently. "I was so afraid when I heard what happened at the ranch. If you had—" She couldn't complete the thought. "It takes more than a few of Harrington's thugs to finish me," Vaughn said, attempting a lightness he clearly didn't feel given the pain evident in his eyes. "Though I'll admit, there was a moment when I wondered if I'd see you again." "You're stuck with me now," she told him, blinking back tears. "We heal together, remember?" His fingers tightened around hers. "I remember, and I intend to hold you to that." Over the next few days, news arrived confirming the effectiveness of their plan. Newspapers throughout Colorado had published the evidence of Harrington's corruption, prompting official investigations by both territorial authorities and federal marshals. Several officials implicated in the bribery scheme had already resigned, and Harrington himself had been seen boarding an eastbound train, reportedly headed for Texas to salvage what he could of his investments there. "He's running," Marcus reported after returning from Walsenburg with the latest news. "The governor has ordered his arrest if he's found in Colorado territory. The man who thought he owned half the state is now a fugitive himself." As Vaughn's strength gradually returned, discussions turned to the future. The Wilson family insisted they remain at the farm until Vaughn was fully recovered, but both Nora and Vaughn felt the pull to return to his ranch to assess the damage and begin rebuilding what had been lost. "It won't be easy," Vaughn cautioned one evening as they sat together on the Wilsons' porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. "The barn needs to be rebuilt before winter, and we lost feed and equipment in the fire." "We'll manage," Nora assured him, the plural coming naturally now. "Between your knowledge and my determination, I'd say we have a fighting chance." He studied her face in the fading light. "You're sure this is what you want?" "A life on a small ranch with a man who can't offer you much beyond hard work and his heart," Nora met his gaze steadily. "I've seen what wealth without love looks like. I nearly married it. What you're offering: partnership, respect, the chance to build something meaningful together that's worth more than all of Edmund Harrington's cattle and land combined." Vaughn's smile was tender as he reached for her hand. "Then I suppose we'd better start planning. The barn won't rebuild itself." 2 weeks later, they returned to Vaughn's ranch, accompanied by Marcus and several neighbors who had volunteered to help with the initial cleanup and rebuilding. The sight of the burned barn sent a pang through Nora's heart, but the cabin stood untouched, waiting for their return. As Vaughn unlocked the door, memories of her first night there rushed back: how she had arrived desperate and afraid, and found unexpected sanctuary with a quiet rancher who understood her fear all too well. Now, she entered not as a fugitive seeking temporary shelter, but as a woman coming home. "Welcome back," Vaughn said softly, watching her face as she took in the familiar surroundings: the hearth where they had shared countless conversations, the table where they had planned their stand against Harrington, the simple furnishings that had become more dear to her than the luxuries of her father's house in Denver. "It's good to be home," she replied, the word carrying all the weight of their shared journey. The months that followed brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. Rebuilding the barn required backbreaking labor, but neighbors appeared regularly to help, their collective effort raising the new structure in half the time it would have taken Vaughn alone. Nora learned to garden properly, to preserve foods for the coming winter, to manage the daily rhythms of ranch life with increasing confidence. Letters arrived from Denver, first from her mother, expressing relief at news of Nora's safety and confusion over the changes in her life. Later from her father, his initial anger giving way to a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps he had been wrong about Edmund Harrington's character. Nora answered each letter honestly but without bitterness, explaining her choices and extending cautious invitations for them to visit when they felt ready. As autumn painted the aspens gold and the first snow dusted the highest peaks, Vaughn and Nora rode to Walsenburg one crisp morning. Their destination was the small church at the edge of town, where Clara, Marcus, Samuel, and Dorothy Jenkins, and a handful of other friends waited to witness their marriage, a union entered freely, with clear eyes and full hearts. The ceremony was simple, the celebration afterward warm with genuine affection from those who had helped them find their way to this moment. As evening approached, they rode back to the ranch, their ranch now, in every sense beneath a sky ablaze with stars. In the years that followed, the O'Malley Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Vaughn's knowledge of cattle and land management, combined with Nora's unexpected talent for organization and planning, created a partnership that extended far beyond their personal bond. They added to their herd each year, eventually purchasing adjacent land from a neighbor who wished to retire to town. Their family grew as well, first with the arrival of their son James in 1881, followed 2 years later by twins Michael and Elizabeth. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, learning from both parents the values of hard work, honesty, and the courage to stand up for what was right. News of Edmund Harrington faded with time. Reports suggested he had fled to Mexico after his Texas holdings were seized to pay debts and legal judgments. Occasionally, stories would surface of a once wealthy American trying to rebuild his fortune through dubious schemes in border towns, but such rumors eventually ceased altogether. On the 10th anniversary of Nora's arrival at the ranch, She and Vaughn stood together on the porch of their now expanded cabin, watching their children playing in the yard with the puppies born to their faithful sheepdog. "Did you ever imagine this?" Nora asked, leaning against Vaughn's solid presence. "That night when I appeared at your door half frozen and terrified, not in my wildest dreams," he admitted, his arm tightening around her waist. "I was just trying to help someone in trouble. I never thought I was opening the door to my own future happiness." "We healed together," she said softly, echoing the words that had given her hope in her darkest moment. "That we did," Vaughn agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And we built something stronger than either of us could have managed alone." As the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, casting long shadows across land that had witnessed their struggles and triumphs. Nora reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a bride fleeing in terror to a woman who had found her strength, her purpose, and her heart's true home. The path had not been easy, but standing beside the man who had offered shelter when she needed it most, surrounded by the family they had created together, Nora knew with absolute certainty that every step, even those taken in fear and desperation, had led her exactly where she was meant to be.